And one of the things I came up with are the myths, and this will be about the only one of the 2 text charts that I'll have. One is that subs are dangerous. And the issue here is you have to separate research and commercial submersibles from military submersibles, which carry munitions and go to dangerous places. Research submersibles don't go in areas where the bottom of the area they're operating in is greater than the crush depth of the submersible, which is what really kills you. So that's one of the big differences. And in the last 35 years, there hasn't been a serious injury, and there have been over 15 million people go in them. Now, most of those are in tourist submersibles, but they're statistically the safest vehicles on the planet.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't hear. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head,
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. As we come to the end of another year in true crime, I want to share some of my impressions of the stories that made the biggest impression on you from my perspective, or I guess the biggest impression on me, perhaps from your perspective, and instances where there was perhaps a disagreement, where maybe you thought something was very important and I didn't, or I thought something was very important and you didn't. This is a critical thinking channel, so we do want to look at what cases taught us something, what cases weren't worth covering, and equally, if we were taught something, what that was. And also which cases didn't teach us anything, perhaps which cases were a waste of time, and why that was. Perhaps you'll disagree, and I hope you do. It'll be interesting to hear what you think, and that'll lead to hopefully more critical thinking on these stories. In this analysis, we're going to review the Titan submersible story from a very interesting perspective, I think. If you think about it, it was a huge missing person search that only one true crime channel covered, certainly as far as I know, or covered consistently as far as I know, and that was this one. And I suppose you could say, yeah, but it wasn't a true crime story. Well, it is under investigation. People did go missing. People did die. 5 people died. I mean, if you're just going on body count, it's one of the biggest tragedies we dealt with this year. Now, before we dive into what we learned from it, I do want to say that this year, 2023, was an incredible one for me because I spent more than 3 months, a quarter of the year, in America. It was my first time to America, and I spent quite a lot of time in America, and it was quite an incredible journey. I haven't fully shared all the things that I saw and felt and did. Can you believe I actually I didn't stay in one place or cover one case. I actually visited at least 15 states. I'll be doing a review, sharing some footage and insights from the visits. Can you guess how many different crime scenes just on the second trip? And I'll be doing that live on the day after Christmas, December 26th. Before we get to the rest of this episode, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're enjoying this analysis, and this is really going to be an unusual analysis of Titan, if you've watched all the episodes, this one really is, I think, worth watching. So if you enjoy it, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started.
We also have used sonar systems, but the visibility is quite good. We just reached agreement with company 3D at Depth that does laser scanning. So you can create a laser image quite rapidly that's almost as good as a photograph. And it doesn't just take the picture, it gives you this 3D model. So when we go back the next year, we can tell if the hull has decayed. So there's an argument out there.
Do you agree that it's impossible to think about the Titan outside of the context of the Titanic? And the Titanic was a huge lesson in humility for human beings, a lesson we were supposed to learn 111 years ago this year. It happened in 1912, and we are now at 2023. Subtract the 2 and you get 111 years. And the lesson in 1912 was that our machines and techno-triumphalism over nature wasn't nearly as marvelous, ingenious, or spectacular as we thought it is. And so the question is, 111 years later, How are we doing in that department? Are we realistic about our preeminence over nature or our connectedness with nature? Are we realistic about it? Do our machines live in harmony with nature? And does nature live in harmony with our empire over this planet? Some might say that 111 is an unlucky number. I think it was for Stockton Rush. But did his luck run out, or was the Titan an accident waiting to happen? Well, that was one of the questions that we addressed through a number of videos. Very recently, Matthew Perry's death was labelled an accident, but without straying too far into that narrative, was his death really an accident, or an accident waiting to happen? Now, it's impossible straying into the subject matter of exploring the unknown, and then it's associated with human tragedies that are unfolding, without thinking about hubris. Some would say, and I'd probably agree with them, that you have to have hubris to do anything that requires courage. The more courage, the more hubris. Going into the unknown, unknown environments like space, traveling to Mars, going to the moon, wherever, what's one of the scariest things we can do, which suggests it requires individuals with the most hubris. The problem with this analogy is that the deep ocean hasn't been an unknown world in terms of the science of it for decades. The same also applies to some extent to space. We've kind of figured a lot of it out already. But the unknown world in terms of this story of the Titan submersible was the Russian roulette Rush was playing using cheap second-hand carbon fiber in an unusual way. He knew it was cracking up and thus breaking up more and more, worse and worse on every descent, but he persisted anyway. From the Washington Post, quote, "Maybe pilot Stockton Rush, who died along with 4 others when his sub imploded, really deserves all the opprobrium that has been heaped upon him. But even so, the useful caution offered by Verhoeven's op-ed stands, are you sure you know as much as you think you do?" And this is such an interesting question because it really applies to all of true crime. And it also applies to us. How much do you know about yourself in your situation? Do you know as much about your own situation as you think you do? Or is there something that you don't know? And of course, one way to put the brakes on any indirect impression is to look at someone else who's had a direct first-hand impression. And so one impression we never dealt with is this one from Sam Howe Verhoeven. Not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but he's the guy who published an op-ed in the Washington Post. And to review what he wrote, he said, quote, "As someone who had a passing acquaintance with Titan's creator, Stockton Rush, I confess that I experienced a gathering sense of dismay as the media story seemingly got baked in real time that the aptly named Rush was a villain, reckless, and negligent." Now, if you just take those 3 descriptors, villain, where we are today, what would you say about that word? Is it apt or is it not apt? Reckless, would you say that is true or not? Negligent, what about that word? He goes on to say, having spent a bit of time with Rush and his wife Wendy just last month, meaning in June, that's June this year, during a reporting trip to Newfoundland and Labrador, and having gotten a good look at Titan, when Rush showed me around the craft as it sat in dry dock maintenance, there before its first exploration of the season, the criticism struck me as cartoonishly one-dimensional. And although this is his perception, what do you think about it now, about 6 months later? Do you think it was one-dimensional? He goes on to say, Rush was tried and convicted in absentia by many in the media as we all waited to find out whether his craft was catastrophically pulled apart, incapacitated on the ocean floor, or, most optimistically, lost somewhere on the surface of the sea. He actually wrote this article less than a week after the events themselves. And so It turned out that it was catastrophically pulled apart. It wasn't incapacitated on the ocean floor in terms of making it safely down to the ocean floor and then perhaps losing navigation. And he says most optimistically lost somewhere. Well, that wasn't the case either. It never made it to the ocean floor. In fact, it appeared to implode on the way up. Now, as a matter of fact, the Rush incident, and that is different to and distinct from the Rust incident, which I also covered on this channel, is technically still under investigation. So I think someone in the media is saying he shouldn't be tried and convicted in the media, but then proposing a defense. Isn't he doing exactly that? Anyway, going back to the article, he says, quote, I think the least we could do now that we know for sure he will never be able to respond to his critics is contemplate his, quote, side of the story, unquote, as we say in the news business. Well, let's hear it. Although, to be fair, Rush has given many speeches, many of them were recorded, and his website scrubbed shortly after the catastrophe. I don't know whether it's true to say we've never gotten his side of the story. I feel like we've constantly gotten his side of the story. We've constantly had interviews that he gave repeated in the news media. And none of this came across terribly well in hindsight, did it? Going back to the article, he writes, first, though, let me come ahead with some by now familiar observations. There is no escaping his responsibility. His clear faith in his machine or his impatience played a role in balancing risk and judgment, and thus led directly to his death and those of his clients. So here he's saying, before we do anything else, let's acknowledge that he is responsible. It's kind of a weird thing to say, we don't want to judge him, but let's first clarify that he is responsible. It's kind of a little bit of a strange thing. Then he says, second, we have to show proper respect for the victims of this endeavor. And of course, the primary victim is referring to here as Stockton himself. I'm not so sure Rush himself showed proper respect either for the science in terms of the whole submersible endeavor, or for his own staff, especially those in the early days of OceanGate, like his former chief pilot, David Lockridge, who he arguably sued into silence. I don't know whether he showed similar respect for other folks in the industry that were giving him advice. Going back to the article, quote, Rush told me all about the titanium in Titan, the NASA-grade carbon fiber wrapped around it, and redundancies built in case of emergency. There's been quite a lot of talk about the lack of actual redundancies, including in the communication side of things. We learned through the course of this year that NASA wasn't involved in Titan. I don't think Boeing were involved either. Certainly not to the extent that all the name dropping suggested it was. And NASA grade or not, Boeing grade or not, carbon fiber is arguably the worst material for the deep ocean. That's maybe one thing that we learned out of all this, us laymen, that we didn't really need to know or need to learn, but I guess some people did. Going back to the article, and while deep exploration of the oceans carries obvious risks, I can't quite accept the notion that he was cavalier about it all. That's where I disagree. The towing of the Titan behind the ship in the fatal final season, and we know that platform got damaged again and again, leading to postponements again and again. That seems particularly cavalier, if you ask me. The ignoring and laughing at the sounds like gunshots, as outside pressure transferred to the hull, and kind of making jokes about it. That's not cavalier as something closer to lunacy. It's like in nature's supposed to respond to its environment, and you've got someone literally purposefully ignoring the responses this craft is making loud and clear to its environment. It's not responding very well, while the person inside it not responding to those responses, even worse. And so the whole jokey attitude to the Spartan interior of the hull, while giving interviews, bragging with a game controller. It seemed designed to lure a young, naive, starry-eyed breed of well-heeled tourist. And I'm sorry, but cavalier seems exactly the right word for Stockton Rush. If cavalier means disdainful, Stockton seemed particularly disdainful of almost the entire submersible community, ignoring, disagreeing, and remaining at odds with their common sense advice, to get his vehicle safely certified. And bear in mind, their vehicles weren't intended for commercial operation or trying to make a profit, whereas his were, and so the safety aspect was even more important. You'd think someone coming from the aerospace and aircraft industry, and as far as I know, Stockton himself flew commercial jets, would be very aware of things like safety protocols, but just not when it's my own vehicle. And so he didn't certify his vehicle because it simply wasn't safe. And even if he tried to certify it, it wouldn't have been certified because it didn't meet the specifications. According to the article, quote, "I knew Stockton through a mutual friend of ours in our hometown of Seattle, and within those circles of acquaintance, he was known as a terrific husband, father, grandfather, and friend, with an infectious, fun-loving curiosity that will linger as an influence long beyond his death." Now, that may all be true. He may have been a wonderful person. He may have been one of the most gifted aeronautical engineers on Earth. But unfortunately, this isn't about flying through the air or into space. It's about the completely different environment that is the deep ocean. And whether he was the nicest guy in the world or the nastiest guy in the world, it's really about his scientific approach to the deep ocean. That's what's important. And there, it's now become apparent Rush was a complete novice. He didn't know what he was doing. He thought he knew better than literally everybody. Did he? Going back to the article, quote, "His risks were calculated ones, however flawed the calculations might turn out to be." This seems like kind of a rationalization saying, he took risks, but they were well thought out. They were well considered. I don't know whether you can use the term calculated in a completely irrational sense, because it's a kind of denial. It feels like the writer of this op-ed is in a similar kind of denial as well. He seems to want to say, I knew him, which means I knew him better than you, which means I know what was going on here better than you. Well, perhaps to know him, and he was undoubtedly likable, affable, charming, perhaps to know him was to be fooled by him. And that aspect is also part of the story, because make no mistake, he was also a salesman, and he was trying to profit out of this. He was taking money for trips that never materialized. He took quite a lot of money from quite a few people for trips that never actually happened. He also made big promises and bragged about one-of-a-kind solutions and one-of-a-kind technology, cheap taxi trips to the Titanic that didn't really exist. The article goes on to say, was Rush reckless? Given the outcome, there's a strong case for yes, though a full inquiry may yet exonerate him to some degree. While it may do the opposite. Bear in mind that inquiry is still underway. Going back to the article, but if an experimental approach to discovery is a crime, then we might as well put the Wright brothers, Charles Lindbergh, and Apollo's lunar-bound astronauts on trial as well. All of them took frightful risks that could have as easily ended in disaster as in triumph. As I said earlier, an experimental approach wasn't necessary here because the technology had been figured out. The problem that Stockton Rush faced was that it was prohibitively expensive to follow along the lines of the conventional technology, which was titanium shaped like a sphere. And of course, titanium shaped like a sphere meant there was limited capacity inside that sphere. And so what he tried to do was extend that sphere into a sausage, thereby being able to add another one or two passengers. And so he was someone who wanted to bus folk to the Titanic at $250,000 a pop, but he's trying to do it cheaply. And in that sense, I don't think one can call that an experimental approach that's deserving of kind of the heroic label. It's not quite the same thing. He goes on to say, that's the kind of faith that can get you killed, but it can also change the world. The trouble isn't just having that level of faith or pride, but having a whole bunch of people caught up in the same ruinous magical thinking that you do. Very much not him, just him that is doing this as an explorer. He's taking along people, members of the public, and convincing them that everything is absolutely safe. And so the question arises in this, was Rush completely honest with those around him? Some reporters said that when he blamed the weather for delays and postponements, when they were on the ship with him, and when he was making excuses or giving reasons why they weren't doing a dive as scheduled, and he was saying, well, it's because of the weather, they weren't always sure whether that was true. And so wasn't that why they put their faith instead in P.H. Nargile? Nargile was there, I suspect, because salesman Stockton knew on some level that even once aboard, not everyone continued to fall for his pitch. The mission specialist started to get a little uncertain, and PH was there to give a kind of a calm sense of security about everything that was going on. And so in this sense, his experimental approach really amounted to flouting well-known safety protocols, well-known industry standards, and it may well turn out to be a crime. It may well turn out to be at such a level of negligence that it is criminal as opposed to some vaunted effort at pioneering. What he was doing, he was pioneering cheap ways to make a shitload of money, not bravely trekking through deep space in a spirit of curiosity and altruism. Defending Rush, as this writer did on June 24th, less than a week after the fact, seems like just more self-rationalizing hubris piled onto self-justifying hubris from Rush himself. All of this based on little more than a first-hand encounter, rather than real insight, real knowledge into the actual science, the actual economics, and essentially the reality behind the Titan tragedy. So this was my perspective. What for you was the lesson you learned out of the coverage of the Titan submersible tragedy? I'd be interested to know. I'm not going to take it further than that, but we will continue this series on the stories that made us think the most this year in a forthcoming episode. So look out for that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.